In this chapter, we'll discuss communication and cultural competence. So the objectives, right, which is the things you're supposed to be gaining from this chapter. So being able to describe the aspects of cultural competence, explaining the difference between the terms assimilation, enculturation, and acculturation, discuss the dimensions of diversity in the workplace, compare the cultural competence models, so there's several that are identified in the text, and identify key counseling strategies effective in culturally diverse populations. So looking at defining culture, so again, this is the sum total of a group's learned and shared behavior. And so again, the most important thing is that culture is learned from others. So again, culture is not something that you're born with, it's something you're born into and that you learn and gain over time. And so it is transmitted formally and informally to the next generation. And so again, this is why you'll see that cultures will shift or change over time based on how that information is transmitted or things that culture encounters. But again, right, it is passed down and slowly evolves. Now looking at components for cultural diversity. So again, we can think of the basics, right? We probably are immediately thinking of things like race and ethnicity, but there's a lot of different things that are part of one's culture, and this is why you'll see differences. So this is things like race, but also age, right? How many times have you heard about the difference in millennials versus Generation X versus the baby boomers? This is things like gender. This is things like religion, disability, right? So the deaf community has a very strong cultural identity. This is things like socioeconomic status or jobs, right? How do you define yourself based on what you do for a living? So I think you probably identified or encountered that food service is a lifestyle, right? That occupation has a very specific culture. Education level, politics, physical ability, sexual orientation, immigration status, and again, it's all of these factors combined, which is why people are such unique individuals, is because you have a lot of different types of cultural pull at one time. Now looking at some of the terms, so you have enculturation, which is how culture is learned. So again, this is not inherited. So when you are becoming immersed or you're being taught or you're gaining from that culture, right, that's enculturation. And so this is passed from generation to generation. But again, we also have to take into account that there is intracultural variations. Remember, inter is between, intra is within. So this is within culture variations. And so populations of one major group and subgroups are going to differ from one another. So for example, you have India, right, in the Indian subcontinent, but while that may be one group based on race, you actually have a large degree of intracultural variation, which is the people within that one overarching umbrella of India there's very, very many different religions, cultures, ethnic groups, etc. So looking at acculturation, so people from one cultural group modify their traditional behaviors, attitudes, and viewpoints as a result of contact with a new dominant culture. So again, we're not having a complete loss of the original culture. We're now going to have some of the new culture, but then also some of their original culture. So again, so some food choices may change. Again, you'll see though they may adopt some less healthy choices, and this is really the biggest concern, right, is that traditional cultural diets are usually pretty healthy. But what happens is you take a population whose genetic profile puts them at very high risk when they consume a standard American or a Western diet. So we then increase the amounts of things like McDonald's or other fast food options, right, and now we've created a problem. And so what we need to do is we need to assess food practices and see what's been adopted from a food standpoint from the new culture, as well as what's been maintained from the original culture, to then try and find the source of any malnutrition or other nutrition issues. Now you also have assimilation. So here members of the minority group adopt practices and belief systems of a dominant group. And so this is different, right? So we had acculturation where we had, in essence, and for easy math, we'll say 50-50. Whereas assimilation, the goal is to completely fit in, so completely adopt all the American customs, traditions, food choices, right, and quote unquote try to be American as much as possible. And so again, and I'm just using America as an example, right, it's anytime you have two cultures mix. But again, here we're looking at, so instead of being 50-50, this is swinging the other way of essentially abandoning one culture and then almost 100% adopting a new culture. So looking at diversity in the workplace, so you've had some changes from a legal standpoint to ensure that we're having a more multicultural workplace and that the most qualified workers are being hired. This is things like equal employment opportunities, affirmative action. You also see, of course, changes for access or accommodation for patients with people with disabilities. And again, looking at the change in the pattern of immigration over time. So again, we previously saw Canadian and European immigrants, and now we're seeing an increase in the number of Asian and Hispanic immigrants, which then changes, again, looking at the workplace, the necessary changes in the workplace, what skills managers will need to work with their new labor force. So some of the challenges faced in the workplace, again, is that level of cultural assimilation. So again, how much have they adopted new behaviors? And again, I think the book will go on and talk about some of those different things when it comes to values about time, attendance, respects for authority, etc. Looking at literacy, which the book talks a little bit later about, and looking at the ability to follow written instructions, looking at speaking or interpreting the English language. So again, what you're going to see in the hospital is that the language is going to be English as standard, but you'll see that many places will prefer that they have speakers who are at least bilingual. And again, it's going to depend on the location. They may even require a manager to speak 3 languages depending on how diverse their workforce is. So this can create barriers with communication. And the other big one is age, with again a change in the age of the workforce, so especially in food service, where you then may have employees that are actually much older than the manager, which again, depending on cultural backgrounds, can create some issues. Now looking at benefits, so again, one of the phrases that I'm always fond of is that if your only tool is a hammer, then everything looks like a nail. And so one of the benefits is that when you have a multicultural workforce, is that you get a variety of ideas, policies, and programs, because again, you're better able to understand the need of your customer base, right? So when you actually have the people from the community involved in your labor force from that culture, you're better able to adopt and change your business practices to meet their needs. And it allows us to better understand the market as a whole. So again, not just an individual, but if you're looking especially at a regional area, or if you're trying to expand a business, right, you're going to have better expectation of what that consumer is expecting. So looking at managing diversity, there's a nice list on page 89 and continuing on to page 90 in the text. And so this is just looking at how we know that we're actually appreciating the multicultural nature of the workforce. So things like the employees that contribute their talents and abilities as individuals, creating a productive environment, everyone feels valued, and employees are viewed as assets, right? So people have this skill set, right? They have this different knowledge based on their culture, based on their life experiences that they can bring to the table and to the workforce. Next, we'll take a look at some cultural competency models. Now, I have not been able to find the name of this first model, so it actually is not mentioned in the text. It just says one model. So the 3 factors, though, that it identifies is that the professional should be aware of their assumptions, values, and biases, having a worldview of culturally diverse clients, and developing appropriate intervention strategies and techniques for those clients. The second model, and this is the one that I'm familiar with, and so this is the ethnic model. And so the things that it says that you should be focusing on is looking at, so explanation of disease, treatment, who they seek as healers, negotiation, so how do you collaborate and work with the clients, interventions, and then collaboration, again with the other healthcare team members to make sure the patient's getting culturally competent care, resources, etc. This is the other model that I'm familiar with, which is the Campina-Baycoat model. And so this is focused on cultural awareness, a practitioner's level of cultural knowledge, their level of cultural skill, their desire to understand another culture, and then purposefully seeking out encounters with that culture to gain more knowledge and exposure. The other model the book briefly mentions is the hand model. And so this is from New Zealand, and it specifically was being used with the Maori tribe. And so they had the thumb representing awareness, and the 4 fingers representing connection, communication, negotiation, and advocacy. So looking at cultural competency in counseling and a cultural assessment. So the things you're going to have to delicately determine with your clients is so their degree of American acculturation, so how many American foods or American habits, lifestyle factors, physical activity, etc. have been adopted. Do they still consume traditional foods? If so, which ones? How foods are made and prepared or purchased. Looking at recipes and food preparation techniques. So again, are we using, in essence, are we still making tortillas at home? Are they now store-bought? The difference in corn versus flour. And looking at family and food interactions. So again, there's usually more to food, again, than just nutrients and calories, right? It's part of a cultural experience, right? If meals are eaten at home as part of a family gathering versus food being eaten out, right? Which again we're seeing more and more in American culture, right? As more meals being eaten away from the home. So looking at health disparities in diverse populations. So I had to take an entire class on this, actually in undergrad. So I had to take social problems, which looked at sociology and a breakdown by diverse racial and ethnic groups and problems across all sectors, nutrition being one of them. But one of those things that we can get these indicators from is Healthy People 2020. Now, like I've said in some previous lectures, we have yet to meet the goals for Healthy People 2020. So Healthy People 2030 will be coming out soon. But again, the numbers will only change in very, very small numbers from a percentage value, but the concepts will not change. So the big focuses we're looking at are so increasing the quality years of life. So again, we want people to actually be physically able. We don't want them to have severe limitations on their quality of life. Looking at social and physical environments that can promote health and eliminating health disparities. And so especially when it comes to looking at a cultural competency, it's those health disparities and where they're found to be in different groups. So looking at the health disparities in diverse populations, for example, there's a higher risk among culturally diverse populations with obesity and diabetes. And so what this tells us, again, we know that the Western diet or the standard American diet is really bad for everyone, but some populations, so the African American population, the Hispanic population, the Pacific Islander population, right, the standard Western diet or the standard American diet is very, very bad, right, and promotes diabetes. And so if we're looking at targeting health messages, then we need to know who needs that information best. So we need those culturally appropriate health messages and treatments. So again, taking into account what that culture is receptive to, as well as what that culture and race, ethnicity, etc. is most vulnerable to. And so, for example, though, when we typically think of this, we're typically thinking of genetic factors, but those aren't the only ones, so the book does provide an example. So looking at gay, bisexual, and the transgender population, so there's an increase, for example, of overweight and obesity in the lesbian population. There's an increased risk of eating disorder in the male, gay, and bisexual population. So again, if you're looking at tailoring your nutrition messages, you have to first identify what that cultural or ethnic or racial group is most at risk for. Now that being all said, we want to target our messages and find out what racial, ethnic, or cultural group is most prone to or what they're at highest risk for. But we still need to be sensitive to stereotype and bias, and again, not make assumptions, right? We're still treating people as individuals. So we don't want to stereotype people based on their national origin, appearance, cultural, racial, ethnic group, etc. So one thing we need to be aware of is ethnocentrism, which is the innate belief that one's values and practices are absolute truth, and in this case, we're thinking of being absolutely correct. And so what that means is that when we encounter someone who doesn't have the same culture or beliefs that we do, we want to be careful that we're not trying to impose or enforce our beliefs on them, right? You have to do it this way or this diet or this medical treatment. And again, trying to understand where they're coming from. And again, helping them in a culturally sensitive manner. And so again, taking a look at true cultural competency, again, it's not just knowing information about another culture, but again, thinking and behaving that allows members of one cultural, ethnic, or linguistic group to work effectively with another, right? You're going to encounter many different types of patients with many different backgrounds, and again, our goal is to always help them get the best health and best possible outcomes. And so looking at, again, beyond nutrition and just understanding health practices as a whole. So culture determines how a person defines health, illness, and treatment. And so most Americans believe in scientific medicine. So again, we're typically looking at germ theory. And so realize that germ theory is really 140-ish years old, maybe a little bit less, right? So germ theory in the grand scheme of things is still relatively new. So many cultures have food and health beliefs that are not grounded in evidence-based foundations. In the sense, we're not saying observational data, we're saying when we're looking at things like randomized controlled trials or things, right, that have been tested in an experimental setting. And so looking at health practices, and again, the book talks about some very broad assumptions, but for example, in Mexico, so health matters may be more of up to fate or God's will. In India, so diseases are caused by an upset in the balance of the body. Haitians, again, believe that some illnesses may originate supernaturally or magically or through voodoo. And again, you see these types of beliefs through all cultures to some degree. And so again, looking at that general cultural competency, not just nutrition information specifically, but looking at nonverbal behavior and body language. So looking, for example, at things like personal contact. Is hugging appropriate? Are handshakes appropriate? Is bowing appropriate? Is cheek kissing appropriate, right? And this is all based on both the culture, the level of familiarity, right? And there's a lot that goes into making the best choice. So of course, when in doubt, you're going to want to go with the more formal choice. This is things like gestures. So again, what's considered rude in one culture may be perfectly acceptable in another. Similar with eye contact, right? In Western society, we're very prone to, right, if you're not making eye contact, you're not listening or paying attention, whereas in many other cultures, right, you don't challenge authority, so you would actually look away from somebody when you are listening. Same thing with interpersonal space. Again, since we're not on campus, it's a little bit harder to show, but you can see, right, some people are arm's length, some people are within arm's length, some people like even more space. Again, what level of PDA is appropriate, and again, the value of time or punctuality, so how on time is someone. And so, for example, the book, though, talks about that in certain Hispanic cultures or in some Asian cultures where time is considered to be more individualized and punctuality isn't as emphasized. Again, then we look at Japanese culture where punctuality is extremely important. So again, we don't want to lump all cultures into one umbrella, and again, to look at individual cultures and then individual people within those cultures. Looking at verbal behaviors, so again, when counseling, we want to avoid slang and colloquialisms. So one, they're less formal, and two, some of the meaning may be lost in translation. They may be more difficult to understand. So when making your language choices, we want to be more formal and respectful. Again, asking clients how they'd like to be addressed. And again, you have that level of familiarity. So for example, here we're in the Deep South, and you could call somebody, right, Mr. or Mrs. by their last name, their first name, or you have, right, which is extremely colloquial in Southern, right, is Miss or Mr. and then their first name, right? And so again, it's not right or wrong, but it's simply finding out what's most comfortable for your client. So again, we want to craft the types of questions we want to ask carefully, and realizing that the client or family may not be talkative, especially with direct questions. And so again, this is why, and we'll talk about some specific question techniques and looking at things like probing questions, right, is that we really want the patient to do most of the talking and find a way to make them comfortable enough to volunteer that information without, in essence, interrogating them. And so again, in addition to understanding verbal and nonverbal cues, we also want a better understanding from a cultural standpoint of family relations and understanding so that families can be patriarchal, so they're led by typically the oldest male, so this would be like dad or grandfather. You have matriarchal families, which are going to be, right, deferring to typically the eldest female, so it's going to be like mom or grandma. And then to what level of involvement you have the nuclear family, so that's just the immediate family versus the extended family. Again, do we all live in one household? Do we not? Then you also have, so you have monocultural families, which identify with one primary ethnic group. So again, this is when we look at more things like assimilation or acculturation. So again, monocultural with just the one culture, and then bicultural families identifying with two or more groups. And so looking at multicultural awareness, right, we also as counselors should be looking inward, so looking at customs and traditions of our own family and culture and the historical connections between our culture and others, and always analyzing our own worldviews, cultural assumptions. So why do we think the way we think? What has our own personal experience been like? Does this affect the way we practice as a practitioner, as a counselor, what we think about other cultures, right? Why are we having those thoughts or making those decisions that we are making? And so ideally looking at food and nutrition from a counseling knowledge, so the things that you would want to know or at least have a decent understanding of going in, and of course you would ask clarification from the patient, is looking at common cultural food choices and common preparation methods, so how that food is prepared, as well as eating patterns. So again, this can be frequency, volume, looking at things like holidays, looking at family dynamics, looking at meal patterns, so how meals are built. And again, we've talked about traditions during celebrations, which again we know are typically different from day-to-day food intake, right? So we typically see, not in all, but in most cultures, right, we see an increase in fat and sugar consumption during holidays and celebrations. And so the way we can increase our food and nutrition counseling knowledge, so by visiting ethnic grocery stores and restaurants, actually trying the food, seeing how it's prepared, visiting neighborhood events. So again, you'll see there's usually a lot of outreach from other cultural groups, whether this be through cultural centers, whether this be through religious outreach, etc. There's workshops, training sessions, and focus groups are typically offered. And you can also do some self-exploration, so trying traditional recipe books. So I would not try, for example, the BBC's recipe on fried rice, but traditional recipe books and attempting to cook the food oneself. And of course, there is educational materials. There's a great book put out by the American Diabetes Association that takes a look at food choices and then looking at diabetes statistics around the world. So again, looking at those nutrition counseling skills. So again, nutrition and cultural assessment. So again, having that background knowledge, identifying nutrition-related problems. So again, if this can be depending on the culture of the diet, the degree of acculturation, is this, for example, excessive saturated fat intake? Is this excessive carbohydrate intake? And so making and planning and implementing appropriate interventions, and again, maintaining credibility. So again, of course, there's some degree of credibility should come from your degree, your training, etc. But some of this you're actually going to have to build with and establish that rapport and credibility with the client or patient. And this is why this is going back to when we talked about avoiding slang or idioms or colloquialisms. You know, as I hear, and I used to see this, and we've gotten better about it as a profession, but I used to see on Instagram and Facebook is, if you want to lose weight, just don't eat any white carbs, right? So that's no white bread, no white flour, no white sugar, no white rice, so on and so forth. And when it comes from a weight standpoint, and even from a diabetes standpoint, especially depending on how the rest of the meal is planned, one, that's just not true. And then two, if you were to tell people from certain racial or cultural groups, just never eat white rice, right? Or never eat white pasta. You're going to lose a lot of credibility with them, right? And so again, something that to you in your head made common sense of, what you really meant was you wanted them to increase their fiber and their micronutrient intake by changing out carbohydrates. But instead, right, we took the shortcut and said, well, just don't eat any white carbs. And that, again, is going to lose you a lot of credibility. And then a translator, so be careful. Again, in a perfect world, of course, you know, if it's a survival situation, you have to use a family member, you can. But most hospitals now, and technology has made this significantly easier, as hospitals have what's called a language line, which is just a telephone, and I pick up one end, you pick up the other, and there's a translator that translates everything for you. And specifically, they're trained in medical knowledge. So again, the problem is that the same way that you would have, you know, a med student would have to learn Latin and Greek, and they learn all these medical terms. There's more to it, which is having to know all of the right terms to explain a medical procedure, a disease process, nutrition, etc. That may require some more precise knowledge than a young family member can provide. Now, again, if you're bilingual and you also become, you know, proficient in that language, that's a whole nother story. But again, avoid using family unless, like I said, it's things like survival situations. So I haven't used a language line when it's, for example, if I have to make sure someone's actually checking their blood sugar or their current blood sugar, just so we know, because it's an emergency, that's one thing. But ideally, right, education is going to be done with translated materials and with a professional translator. And so tying into that and looking at those professional educational materials. So again, looking at the fact that we do have limited literacy. So again, if you actually take a look at literacy rates around the globe, the U.S. would rank much lower than you would realize. And so 25% of the U.S. adult population cannot understand materials at the basic level. So really we recommend that materials be at a 5th grade level unless you have a very specific target audience that you know is going to be at a higher level. So for example, if you're a professor teaching grad students, of course you're not going to be teaching them with materials at the 5th grade reading level. But for the general public, it needs to be at a 5th grade level. And so this level of literacy, though, can be determined and has many factors, such as lower socioeconomic status, age at which they dropped out of school, could be learning disabilities, and then also taking a look at the elderly and immigrants. So again, if they, for example, grew up on a farm, literacy wasn't necessary or emphasized. Or again, looking at if immigrants are able to read a new language, or you also may have the reverse where someone can speak a language but they actually can't write it. So especially if they grew up around a language from family members, and so they are very conversational, but they may not be able to write the language. So again, read or write the language. So again, don't make assumptions if you're bringing educational materials, right? I would always recommend, and what I have in my clipboard is I carry both, because again, you don't want to, oh, well, I assume they speak Spanish, and you give it to them, and you're going to look like an idiot. So again, just make sure you're prepared for both situations, and again, ask questions appropriately. And so the text does have some good information on this of how you can determine someone's level of literacy without being offensive. So thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.